My name is Rachel Doss, and I was 37 the year my own family put a price tag on grief and handed me the bill. I remember standing at the edge of two open graves, my shoes sinking into ground still soft from a week of rain, when my phone started vibrating against my ribs. My husband Mark was in one of those graves. My daughter Hope, just turned 7, was in the other. My parents and my younger brother hadn't come. They'd called the funeral not really necessary to attend, then boarded a flight to Cancun the following morning. 5 days after I lowered my whole world into the dirt, my mother finally called, not to ask how I was breathing, but to ask about money. What came out of her mouth in that call is the reason I no longer use the word mom for her, not even in my head. If you're new here, welcome to Quiet Storms, stories about women who get knocked flat by the people who were supposed to catch them, and who get back up anyway. If this ever makes you feel a little less alone, stay a while. This particular story begins in the worst 7 days of my life and ends somewhere none of us saw coming. These days I'm up before the sun, somewhere around 4:30. I cross the dark yard to my truck without bothering to flip on the porch light anymore. There's no one left inside to notice if I do. The first thing my hand finds every morning is the cold brass of my keys. By the time I reach the rig, they've warmed against my palm, and the cab still smells like diesel and yesterday's coffee. For a short stretch before sunrise, that smell is the only thing in my life that still feels entirely mine. I'd been driving long haul for nearly a decade before any of this happened. Truck stop attendants used to assume Mark was the owner and I was just riding along, and for years I let them believe it because correcting people took more energy than I had. Mark loved it, actually. He'd lean back with his coffee and watch some dispatcher hand him paperwork that was supposed to go to me, then wait, grinning, for the moment they realized the woman with grease under her nails was the one signing the checks. I still keep his travel mug clipped into the cup holder. I never drink from it. I just like that it's there. People imagine grief as something loud, wailing, collapse, a dramatic unraveling. Mostly it's quieter than that. It's reaching sideways in bed for someone who isn't there. It's 2 small pairs of rain boots, purple, still lined up by the back door exactly where Hope kicked them off. I keep telling myself I'll move them. Another morning comes. I don't. 11 months ago, I still had a family waiting for me at the end of every run. Before I tell you how I lost the people I buried, I need to tell you something harder. How the people who share my blood decided, in the same week, that they had somewhere better to be. It had rained for 3 days straight that spring, the kind of storm that turns a lazy creek into a churning wall of brown water in under half an hour. I was 400 miles away on a delivery, hauling something I can't even remember now, when my phone lit up at a gas station outside Tulsa. Mark had picked Hope up early from her grandmother's because of the weather warnings. He was careful. 15 years behind the wheel without so much as a fender bender, the kind of man who eased off the gas at a yellow light even when the car behind him leaned on its horn. He took the back road home because the highway was already flooding. There's a low crossing out past Miller's Creek, a shallow concrete dip where the water usually trickles under the road without anyone noticing it's there. That afternoon the creek rose over the crossing while their car was still on it. Searchers found the vehicle 2 days later, caught against a stand of sycamores nearly half a mile downstream. I won't walk you through what came after that. Some things don't belong in a story, and Hope was 7 years old. She deserves more dignity than being reduced to a tragic detail. What I'll tell you is that I made the drive home in just over 7 hours, no sleep, hands locked white-knuckled on the wheel, running through every if only a person can invent. If I'd said no to that run. If I'd been the one driving. If I'd warned Mark harder about that crossing. I beat the news home by less than an hour. The casseroles were already piling up on my porch, a deputy's truck already parked in my driveway. The first call I made, before I could even form full sentences, was to my mother. Of everyone alive, I believed she would come. Her first question was whether the service could be pushed back 2 weeks. I sat down hard on my kitchen floor, certain I'd misheard her. She and my father had a trip already booked. Cancun, 8 days, my brother Daniel and his wife Brooke and their 3 kids, all of it planned since the new year, deposits long since paid. I told her my husband and my daughter were dead. She responded the way you'd respond to a coworker who'd missed a Tuesday meeting. Then Brooke took over the family group chat, because Brooke always takes over. She wrote that of course everyone felt terrible, but the flights were non-refundable, the kids had been counting down the days, and surely I wouldn't want everyone to sacrifice the whole trip over, and she actually typed this, where everyone could read it. Something that, in the grand scheme, isn't really worth rearranging our lives for. Not worth rearranging their lives for. My daughter's funeral. I read that sentence so many times the words stopped looking like words. 2 minutes later my mother's only reply was a thumbs up and the word, agreed. Not one of them asked how Hope had died. Not one asked what to put on Mark's headstone, or whether I'd eaten that week, or whether I was alone in a house with 2 small empty boots by the door. They asked which week worked better for their schedule. I stopped explaining. I told them the burial was Saturday, with or without them, and then I hung up and didn't call again. For the first time in 37 years, I understood something cold and absolute about the people who raised me. They had never once, not really, chosen me. Strangely, knowing it didn't break me further. It just freed both my hands for what was coming. At the service, the front pew, reserved for immediate family, sat empty. I chose to sit in the second row instead, with the people who'd actually shown up. My Uncle Walt drove 5 hours from across the state and stood beside me the entire service, one hand braced on my shoulder like he was holding up a fence post in a windstorm. The little church filled anyway. Mark's co-workers came straight from their shifts. The regulars from the diner where we used to eat came. Hope's first-grade teacher came and cried harder than I did. The youth soccer team Mark coached on weekends filled an entire row in their muddy blue jerseys. My parents were on a beach. My brother was on a beach. Their seats stayed pristine and empty while over 100 ordinary, hard-working people packed shoulder to say goodbye to a truck driver and a little girl who loved drawing trucks. I delivered the eulogy myself. I didn't trust the words to anyone else's voice. I said Mark slowed down for yellow lights. I said Hope drew highways and 18-wheelers instead of princesses. I said they were the best things I'd ever helped build, and the only things I couldn't keep. I never mentioned the empty pew. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room could see it perfectly well on their own. Afterward, Walt walked me to my car and said the one honest thing any relative offered me that entire month. They're not coming back to you the way you need them to. Build your life around that truth now, not later. I buried my husband and daughter surrounded by the people who'd actually shown up, and as I stood there afterward with wet grass under my boots, my phone buzzed again. My mother's name, glowing on the screen, calling from Honolulu. I let it ring out into the silence. I had no idea yet what she wanted. 5 days later she finally caught me on the phone, mostly because I was too exhausted to keep dodging. There was no, "How are you holding up?" No apology for missing it. Just airport noise in the background and my mother's voice flipping straight into business mode, the tone of someone calling about a past due invoice. "Rachel, we need to talk about the money." I sat down. I asked what money. She said the $40,000, like I should already know exactly what she meant. Then she explained that Daniel's auto shop was drowning in debt, that the family needed to pull together, that I needed to see the bigger picture. When I didn't answer fast enough, she delivered the line I'll hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. "We can always make more money, Rachel. We can't make more family." She said that to me. To the daughter whose family was freshly buried because she and my father wouldn't get on a plane home. She said it from an airport in Hawaii, sand probably still caught in her sandals, while asking me to hand over $40,000 to rescue the son who'd been sunbathing while my daughter went into the ground. I held the phone away from my ear and looked at those 2 small purple boots by the door. I thought about how someone can take the most sacred word in any language, family, and use it like a crowbar to pry money out of a person they'd already abandoned. I came dangerously close to laughing, and dangerously close to something much darker. Instead I asked one quiet question, "Which $40,000 do you think belongs to you?" Silence stretched on the line. the particular silence of someone who has already decided what they're owed and just hasn't said it out loud yet. In that pause, I began to understand exactly what they believed I owed them, and exactly how wrong they were. Here's the real story of that $40,000. For years before any of this, before tragedy ever touched our family, I wanted to stop hauling other people's freight and buy my own rig. A decent used tractor ran close to $90,000. I'd saved most of it through years of overtime, but I was short, and Mark and I needed a bank loan to bridge the gap. The loan officer flagged a $40,000 chunk of the down payment and asked, as lenders always do, where it had come from. It had come from my parents, gifted to me in front of Daniel one Christmas when they were feeling flush and generous, explicitly called a gift toward my future. Banks don't run on good faith. When part of a down payment comes from relatives, the lender requires a signed letter, a real legal document stating plainly that the money is a gift, that no repayment is owed, that it was never structured as a loan. I didn't think much of it at the time. I drove the paperwork to my parents' house myself, sat at their kitchen table, and watched both of them sign their names to that letter so I could buy my truck. Then I filed it away with the rest of my loan documents and forgot it existed entirely, the way you forget about a spare key until the day your front door is locked and you need it more than anything else you own. My mother had apparently forgotten it too. Or, more likely, she'd quietly reclassified it in her mind. 4 years later, with Daniel sinking and my whole life freshly buried, that gift had transformed into an investment, the kind of investment a family could supposedly call back in whenever convenient. She had no idea what was sitting in my filing cabinet. Daniel called the next day to finish what our mother had started. My brother is 34 and has spent his entire adult life being labeled the responsible one, which mostly meant being the one our parents bankrolled. He'd opened an auto repair shop 2 years earlier with money he didn't really have, and now the loans were strangling him, the lot full of inventory nobody wanted. He didn't ask about hope either. He led with the business, then with family obligation, then with a sentence that told me everything I needed to know. Look, Rachel, you're alone now. What do you even need that money for? I let that hang in the air. Alone now. As though my husband and daughter were simply a line item he'd helpfully zeroed out for me. As though grief came with a convenient refund. Then Brooke texted, because Brooke cannot tolerate a silence. She explained that family money was a shared resource, that I'd drawn from that pool once and it was someone else's turn now, and that frankly my attitude was hurting the whole family. A shared pool. I'd repaid my parents' generosity 100 times over through the years in ways they never bothered to count, but you cannot pay back people who keep redrawing the lines of the debt. The worst part wasn't even the asking. It was discovering, through a cousin a week later, that they'd already been spinning their version of events to the entire extended family. Poor Daniel struggling while selfish Rachel sat on her trucks and refused to help her own blood. They'd built the narrative before I'd even said no. They simply needed me to step into the role of villain they'd already written for me. I decided then I wouldn't bother arguing with their story. I'd simply outlast it. I'd love to tell you I never wavered. That would be a lie. There's a pattern a lot of us fall into, carrying the entire weight ourselves rather than risk a confrontation. I'd been the one everyone leaned on since I was 10 years old, packing my little brother's lunches because our mother was always too tired. So one night, about a week into the calls, I actually sat down with my checkbook. $40,000 would empty everything I had saved, but it would make the phone stop ringing, and some exhausted, depleted part of me just wanted the noise to end. Walt caught me at it. He'd taken to stopping by often, fixing things around the house that didn't need fixing, sitting in Mark's old recliner so it wouldn't sit empty. He saw the checkbook open on the table and didn't raise his voice. He just asked, quietly, "You're really going to pay them to keep skipping your family's funerals?" I set the pen down. He was right. I wasn't afraid of being called ungrateful. I was just so conditioned to being the fixer that I'd nearly fixed the wrong problem entirely. If you've ever been the one everyone leans on and nobody catches in return, stay with me, because this is exactly where I stopped carrying people who couldn't be bothered to stand at my daughter's grave. I capped the pen, closed the checkbook, and the next morning at 4:30 I did the one thing that has never once failed me. I went back to work. Returning to work meant facing every person who assumed I'd collapse without Mark. The loan officer overseeing my line of credit asked, in a tone gentler than outright rudeness but somehow worse, whether I'd thought about selling the equipment while it still held value. A freight broker I'd worked with for years suddenly developed doubts about whether my small operation could keep running. I heard secondhand that a couple of them were telling shippers I wouldn't make it through the season, just a grieving widow with 2 trucks and no real plan. They'd already counted me out. My keys stayed cold in my hand most mornings, and some days that cold metal was the only thing holding me upright. But I gripped them anyway, because they were the one thing in my life that was unquestionably still mine. Then Pam found me. Pam's pushing 60, ran dispatch for a regional carrier for nearly 3 decades, and knows more about freight in her sleep than most brokers will ever learn awake. She took me to breakfast, bought me eggs, and gave me the only piece of business advice that actually mattered. From here on, people are either working with you or working against you. There's no in-between chair. Stop waiting for the doubters to come around, just make them irrelevant. So I did exactly that. I called every shipper who had ever trusted Mark and told them the plain truth. The owner had always been the woman with grease under her fingernails, and she was still showing up on time every time. I undercut no one and simply outworked everyone. About 3 weeks later, a contract landed on my desk too large for 2 trucks to handle. A regional grocery chain, steady volume, real money, the kind of account that builds something lasting. All I had to do was be brave enough to take it. To fulfill that contract, I needed a second tractor on the road fast, so I began clearing out Mark's old rig to sell it and free up capital. That truck had been his pride. Spotless interior, meticulous maintenance logs, a cheap plastic toy horse Hope had glued crookedly to the dashboard because, in her words, Daddy needed a friend. I sat in that cab for the better part of an hour before I could bring myself to touch anything. Eventually I started clearing his belongings, gently, the way you'd go through a sleeping person's pockets. His sunglasses, an old church bulletin, a roll of quarters for the air pump, and tucked beneath a folded road map in the door pocket, his logbook. Not the digital kind required by law these days, the old paper kind he kept anyway, out of stubborn habit. 15 years of his life recorded in careful pencil, every route, every mile, in his neat block handwriting. I held it and couldn't make myself open it. It felt like holding his actual hands. I told myself I'd read it later, once I was stronger, and set it on the passenger seat beside his coffee mug and the little plastic horse. But before I set it down, I'd noticed something. The final page wasn't a route entry. It was something more. A block of handwriting, far longer than any log entry, filling the lines. He'd written something there before he died, something I'd never known existed, and now it sat 2 feet away from me, waiting. I drove home with that logbook riding shotgun like a passenger. I'll admit it honestly, I was afraid of that page. Some part of me already understood that whatever Mark had written there was going to change what I did next, and I wasn't sure I was ready to be changed. It took me 3 more days to work up the courage to open it. While that logbook sat closed on my kitchen table, my family went to work dismantling my reputation. Brooke ran the campaign, because Brooke treats every family conflict like a marketing rollout. The texts arrived daily, reminders of everything our parents had supposedly done for me, guilt disguised as concern, pointed questions about whether I'd gotten help, for how bitter I'd become. She forwarded a photo of Daniel's kids with a caption about the family possibly losing their home, as though their house and my dead daughter belonged on the same emotional scale. She worked the extended relatives hard, too. My cousin Tess called to warn me what was circulating, that I'd come into money and abandoned the family, that grief had hardened me, that our parents were heartbroken over my coldness. The same parents who'd been swimming with dolphins while I picked out a child-sized casket. They'd inverted the entire story. In their version, they were the wounded party, and I was the villain refusing to help her struggling brother. For about a day, it genuinely sickened me. A lie repeated by enough people starts to feel like simple weather, something you just have to endure. Then it sharpened into clarity instead. They weren't going to stop on their own. People who rewrite history to cast themselves as victims never willingly put the pen down. Tess, to her enormous credit, wasn't buying any of it. "I was at that funeral, Rachel," she told me. "I saw the empty pew myself. I'm not losing my mind." That was the first real crack. One person in that family who'd witnessed the same room I had and recognized the truth for what it was. I didn't know yet how much I'd come to rely on her, but I filed her away mentally, right alongside the gift letter and the logbook, in the growing collection of things that were going to matter later. Tess called again on a Thursday evening. Her voice dropped lower than usual, the register people use when they're sharing something they probably shouldn't. "They're planning something," she said. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was approaching, a large gathering booked at the community hall, the entire extended family invited. I hadn't planned to attend, but Tess had overheard my mother and Brooke mapping out a strategy at my aunt's kitchen table. They intended to corner me there, publicly. My father was going to stand up during the toasts and make a direct appeal to the family, framing me as the ungrateful daughter who refused to help in their time of need. They were betting I'd either cave under the pressure of 40 relatives watching, or refuse and confirm every cold, bitter thing they'd been saying about me. Either outcome served their story. It was a trap built with 2 exits, both leading exactly where they wanted me to go. Tess thought I should skip it entirely, stay home, stay safe, deny them the stage. For a moment, that's exactly what I planned to do. Then something inside me went very still and very calm, the way it does on a steep downhill grade right when the brakes start fading and the fear simply evaporates into pure focus. They wanted an audience. 40 people gathered in one room to watch them humiliate me. But an audience cuts both ways. They were building a stage meant to take me down. I started wondering what else a stage and 40 witnesses might be useful for. That same night, I finally opened the last page of Mark's logbook. I poured a coffee I never drank, sat down at the table, and turned to the back. There it was, his block handwriting, dated the week before he died. It wasn't a love letter. Mark was never a love letter kind of man. It was a list, titled exactly the way he titled everything. Plain, direct, no decoration. Things we're going to do. Buy our own rig outright, no bank involved. Get our own name on the door instead of someone else's. And then the line that knocked the floor out from under me, Doss and daughter, so Hope grows up knowing her mama built something real. He'd already chosen our company name. The business we'd always talked about starting and never quite got around to. Doss and daughter, for the little girl who drew highways instead of princesses, so she'd grow up watching her mother run something that carried her own name on the door. I sat with that for a long time. The next morning, I reached up to the visor of his cab, where I knew Hope kept her drawings clipped, and unhooked the one that had been riding there for nearly 2 years. 3 lopsided crayon trucks in a row, a stick figure with bright yellow hair standing beside them, and underneath, in careful first-grade handwriting, Mama's trucks. I'd seen that drawing 100 times and never truly looked at it. They'd called her funeral something not worth rearranging schedules for. They'd treated my entire life like an inconvenient line item. And I was about to make that little girl's name worth more than their entire vacation combined. I didn't decide what came next in a flash of rage. I decided it the way you choose to take a long, dangerous grade in a lower gear, deliberately, eyes wide open. The following week, I filed the paperwork. The business stopped being Rachel Doss, owner-operator, and became Doss and Daughter Freight. I kept and daughter even though she was gone, because some names you earn through love, not through presence. Renaming the company shifted something in how I carried myself. I wasn't simply grieving and waiting for the storm to pass anymore. I had something to build, my daughter's name on the door, and people who'd lied about both of us. I decided I would attend the anniversary party after all, but not to fight. I've never won anything by being the loudest voice in a room, and I wasn't about to start at my parents' anniversary. I'd go for exactly one reason, to lay the truth out in front of every witness they'd gathered, somewhere they couldn't spin it away with a phone call or delete with a text. But truth alone had never been enough for that family. They'd been bending it my whole life. I needed something undeniable, something with their own signatures attached. That's when I remembered the gift letter, filed away for 4 years alongside my loan paperwork, signed by both my parents, stating in plain legal language that the $40,000 had been a gift, not a loan. The problem was I wasn't certain my personal copy was still legible, and I knew the original lived in my bank's records. If I was going to set that document down in front of 40 people, it needed to be official. Certified. Beyond dispute. So I did the unglamorous part. I called my bank and asked how a borrower requests a certified copy of a document from her own closed loan file. The representative said it would take a few business days and a small processing fee. A few days and a small fee. That was the entire cost of the thing that was about to turn their faces to stone. I marked the anniversary date on my calendar and started counting down, no longer with dread, but with readiness. The loan officer who pulled my file was younger than the one who'd handled my original closing, but he found it without much trouble. I sat across the desk while he flipped through 4-year-old paperwork, and then he slid a single page toward me. There they were. My mother's signature, my father's signature, and above them, the precise legal language banks use to remove all doubt. The funds represent a gift. No repayment is expected. This is not, in any form, a loan. Both of them had signed it at their own kitchen table while I sat watching. I had the officer produce a certified copy, stamped and dated, and drove it home laid flat on the passenger seat as if it might blow away in the wind. The whole drive home I kept hearing Daniel's voice. You're alone now, what do you even need it for? And I finally understood exactly what I needed it for. Not the money itself. I never intended to collect that $40,000 and never wanted to. I needed the one document that proved, beyond argument, which of us had been telling the truth. And I needed it in front of every person they'd lied to. I wasn't assembling a case to scream at anyone. I was assembling a case so I could remain perfectly calm while everyone around me lost their composure. That's the part nobody warns you about when it comes to setting the record straight the right way. The strongest presence in any room is never the loudest voice. It's the quiet person holding the paperwork. I placed the certified copy in a plain folder and set it by the front door, next to my keys, and waited for the day to arrive. In the meantime, the business kept growing. I took on the grocery contract, bought a second tractor to cover it, then leased a third when the freight volume kept climbing. I hired real drivers, good ones, men, and one standout woman who'd left bigger companies because I paid fairly and never lied to my people. We painted the trucks a deep forest green with the company name in clean white block letters down both doors, Doss and Daughter Freight. And beneath it, small enough that you'd only notice if you really looked, we had them paint Hope's 3 lopsided crayon trucks, traced exactly from her drawing. The first time I saw all 3 rigs lined up in the yard with her artwork riding along the doors, I had to sit in my truck for a while before I could drive. The broker who doubted I'd survive the season called asking if I had room for his overflow freight. The loan officer who'd once gently suggested I sell everything quietly raised my credit line without my even asking. Funny how fast, she'll never make it, turns into, we always believed in her, once the trucks are rolling and the invoices clear on time. I didn't gloat about any of it. I simply remembered. Word travels fast in a small town, and it traveled straight back to my family. Suddenly the daughter who was alone now, and supposedly didn't need help was running a legitimate company with her name, and her daughter's name, painted across 3 trucks. They could sense the shift. The same relatives who'd skipped the funeral started liking my photos online. My mother even sent a single warm text, the first kindness she'd offered in months. We're so proud of everything you've built, honey. So proud of the very thing they'd tried to drain $40,000 out of. I didn't respond. I just made sure that certified copy stayed exactly where it was, by the door, and kept counting down the days. The closer the party got, the louder my mother's version of events became. She'd stopped expecting the check and started defending her story instead, which mattered to her far more than the money ever had. At church, at the salon, around her sister's table, she told anyone who would listen that I'd abandoned the family, that success had gone to my head, that I'd let one tragedy, her exact words, turn me bitter against my own blood. And she kept reaching for that same line she'd used to ask for the money, except now she aimed it squarely at me. "We can't make more family," she'd say, shaking her head, full of sorrow, as though I were the one who'd flown to Mexico. As though I'd been the one to call a child's funeral not worth rearranging a schedule for. She'd taken the most sacred word she knew and twisted it until I was somehow the villain holding it. I learned all of this through Tess, who'd quietly appointed herself both my spy and my closest friend. And Tess did something I'll never forget. She started correcting people gently, without making a scene. Whenever someone repeated my mother's version at the grocery store or the gas station, Tess would simply say, evenly, "That's strange, because I was actually at that funeral. Your aunt and uncle weren't. They were in Mexico. I have the dates if you'd like to see them." And she genuinely did have the dates. People started doing the math themselves. A few of them quietly stopped repeating the story altogether, the way people do when something they've been saying turns out to be the exact opposite of true. The ground was shifting beneath my mother's feet, and she hadn't noticed yet. She still believed she was walking into her anniversary party to put her daughter back in her place. She had no idea the place had already moved out from under her. What truly cracked the whole story open was a single photograph. My mother, like a lot of people her age, loved posting pictures online and understood almost nothing about how timestamps work. Buried in her feed from that spring was a cheerful photo of the whole group, leis around their necks, drinks in hand, my nieces and nephews laughing in the surf. The caption read something about making memories together. The timestamp read the morning after Mark and Hope went into the ground. Tess found it. She didn't even need to say anything cutting. She simply placed that photo side by side with the funeral date and let people draw their own conclusions. A beachside cocktail photo, dated the day after a 7-year-old's burial. You can spin a lot of things with a phone call and a sympathetic tone. You cannot spin a timestamp. The relatives who'd been nodding along to my mother's version now had 2 dates in front of them, and the gap between those dates was an ocean and a child's grave. A few of them came to me afterward, awkward and apologetic, claiming they'd never known, that my mother had told them I'd never even invited anyone, which was its own separate lie. I didn't rub it in anyone's face. I simply explained calmly that the service had been open to anyone who wanted to attend, and that I was grateful to everyone who'd actually come. I saved the real heat for the people who'd earned it. That photograph accomplished in a single timestamp what 100 angry words from me never could have. It quietly transformed the witnesses my parents had gathered to use against me into witnesses who now stood, unknowingly, on my side. The party was 4 days away when I finally did something I hadn't managed in 11 months. I drove out to the lake. Not the crossing. I will never go back to that crossing. This was the lake upstream, where Mark used to take Hope to skip rocks on quiet Sunday mornings while I caught up on sleep at home. I went at dawn, when the water lies flat and silver and still, like the whole world is holding its breath. I'd been avoiding that lake the way you avoid pressing on a bruise, certain that standing there would finally break me in half. It didn't. I sat on the bank with a cup of coffee, my own mug this time, not Mark's, and talked to them for a while. I told Hope about the trucks with her artwork painted on the doors. I told Mark I'd finally used the name he'd written down. I told them both what I was planning to do, and out loud, to the still water, I asked myself whether I was doing it for the right reasons. Sitting there in the quiet, I got my answer. I didn't actually want to see my parents ruined. I didn't want Daniel's children to lose their home. I'm simply not built to take pleasure in other people's collapse, even when they'd earned it. What I wanted was simpler, and somehow harder to admit. I wanted the truth on record. I wanted 40 witnesses to know exactly what had happened, so that the next time my mother dismissed my daughter's death as something not worth rearranging a vacation for, there would be a room full of people who knew better. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth to stop being optional. For people like my family, it turns out those 2 things can look identical from the outside. And I'd finally stopped feeling responsible for how the truth made them feel. The water stayed flat and silver the entire time. For the first time since the accident, standing at that lake didn't break me apart. It steadied me instead. The night before the party, Walt stopped by. Word travels through a family eventually, no matter how quietly you try to plan something, and he'd heard what was coming. He offered to come with me, to stand beside me in that hall, to make sure I wasn't facing all of them alone. It was a generous, loving offer, and I turned it down. Not because I didn't want him there, but because I'd finally understood I didn't need a shield. Shields are for people who expect to lose. I wasn't walking into that hall to lose. I was walking in with the truth, one certified document, and the steadiest hands I'd had in a year. Walt, I told him, if I bring backup, it looks like I'm starting a war. I'm not going to fight them. I'm going to tell 40 people something true, and then I'm going to leave. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded the same way he had at the funeral, like a man who understood exactly when to hold the fence post steady and when to trust it to stand on its own. Your father never had your backbone, he said quietly. Neither did your brother. I took it for the compliment it was meant to be. After he left, I laid out my clothes for the next day. Simple, dark, nothing showy, because I wasn't dressing to impress anyone in that room. I slipped the certified copy of the gift letter into my coat pocket, one folded page, and hung the coat by the door. 40 years of marriage, $40,000 they believed was owed to them, and I was walking in with exactly one sheet of paper. I slept better that night than I had since the funeral. Once you finally know what you're going to do, fear has nowhere left to live. The community hall smelled like coffee, carnations, and 4 decades of potluck dinners. They dressed it up nicely, a long table draped in white linen, a sheet cake printed with my parents' wedding photo in edible sugar, a gold banner reading 40 years, stretched across the back wall, and roughly 40 relatives milling about, which struck me with a kind of grim irony. 40 years. $40,000. 40 witnesses. My mother spotted me walking in, and her expression did something complicated, surprise and triumph arriving together, because she hadn't been certain I'd actually show. Now that I had, she clearly believed I'd walked straight into her trap. Brooke air-kissed my cheek. Daniel avoided my eyes entirely. Someone handed me a paper plate of cake I had no intention of eating, and I waited, because I already knew what was coming. There's a particular calm that settles over you when you're the only person in the room who already knows how the scene is going to play out. They worked through the toasts. Then my father stood, tapped his fork against his glass, and the room quieted for him. I watched him decide, in real time, to go through with it in front of everyone. He thanked the room for coming, talked about the importance of family, about sticking together through hard seasons. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, to face me directly. Some of us, he said, have been blessed, and seem to have forgotten where that blessing came from. We helped Rachel when she had nothing, $40,000, and now that she's doing well, she won't lift a finger for her own brother. A murmur rippled through the hall. Right on cue, Brooke added her line, sweet as poisoned honey, just loud enough to carry. It's really a shame. We even missed that funeral for the sake of family, and this is the thanks we get. She'd actually said it again, in slightly different words, in front of the entire room. That funeral hadn't been worth rearranging their schedule for. Every face in the hall turned toward me. My mother sat with her hands folded primly, utterly certain she'd already won. I set down my paper plate and stood up. I didn't raise my voice. That's the part one most want you to understand, because it's the part that mattered. 40 people had braced themselves for a scene, and instead I gave them silence. And silence, in a room expecting a shouting match, turns out to be the loudest thing in the world. Dad, I said, you're right that you gave me $40,000. Let's absolutely talk about that. But first, since Brooke brought it up, let's talk about the funeral. I reached into my coat and drew out a single sheet of paper, unfolded it slowly, and laid it flat on the white tablecloth beside the wedding cake. A simple printed timeline, plain dates side by side. This, I said, pointing, is the day my husband and my daughter were buried. I shifted my finger an inch. And this is the timestamp on the beach photo Mom posted, 1 day later. Making memories, the caption said. I looked up at the room. You didn't miss a funeral because of family obligations. You skipped a 7-year-old's funeral for a vacation, then flew home and asked the grieving mother for $40,000. The hall went absolutely still. My father's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. I watched my mother's certainty drain out of her face like water pulled down a drain. Then Daniel did exactly what loud people do when a quiet person refuses to flinch. He exploded. He shot up out of his chair, face flushed red, shouting that I was twisting the facts, that the shop was failing, that I owed this family, that I was selfish and bitter and alone. The entire rehearsed script, delivered at full volume in a community hall full of relatives. I let him finish completely. When he finally ran out of breath, I reached into my coat one last time and pulled out the second page, the certified copy, and laid it beside the timeline, sliding it across the white cloth toward my father. You both signed this, I said, 4 years ago at your own kitchen table. It's the gift letter the bank required. In your own signatures, it states the $40,000 was a gift, no repayment expected, not a loan in any form. I let the silence stretch. So a demand to repay it as a debt doesn't really hold up, does it? You're welcome to ask me for help the way anyone asks anyone. You don't get to bill me for a gift you swore, in writing, was never a loan. Then I said the 3 things I'd actually come there to say, and I said them gently, because they didn't need any extra force behind them. To Brooke, you taught me exactly which events are worth showing up for. I'll remember that lesson for the rest of my life. To my mother, who had gone pale as paper, you told me we can't make more family. You were right. So I've stopped trying to make one out of you. And to Daniel, still standing there with his fists half clenched, you asked what I even needed that money for. I needed it to bury my daughter. You needed Cancun. Nobody said a word. Then a chair scraped against the floor at the back of the hall, and Tess stood up. Every word of that is true, she said clearly. I was at that funeral. I have the dates myself. After Tess spoke, the room turned the way a fully loaded truck turns, slowly at first, then all at once. An aunt I'd barely spoken to in years quietly reached over and adjusted the gift letter so more people nearby could read it for themselves. People who'd arrived ready to condemn the cold, ungrateful daughter were now staring at a printed timeline, 2 signatures, and a beach photo, doing the only honest thing left available to them, looking ashamed of what they'd been so quick to believe. My mother said my name once, like a question. Like some part of her still believed there was a version of this evening where I simply sat back down and we all ate cake together. There wasn't. And Daniel, my loud brother, finally ran completely out of steam and just stood there. For one brief second, I saw what was actually underneath all that entitlement, pure fear. He was genuinely terrified of losing the business, maybe the house, watching his own kids absorb the fallout, and he'd gambled the entire family's goodwill on bullying me into bailing him out. Now the whole room was looking at him instead. "Danny," he said quietly for the first time all night, "I'm scared." And I believed him completely. It was the most honest thing any of them had said to me in 11 months. I felt the old instinct twitch, the same one that had packed his school lunches since he was small enough to need help reaching the counter. But he still hadn't said he was sorry about Hope. Not her name. Not that day. Not the empty pew. Scared for himself. Never once sorry for me. So I gathered my 2 pages, folded them back into my coat pocket, and said the truest thing I had left to give him. I hope you figure it out, Daniel. I genuinely do. But you're going to have to figure it out without me. Then I walked out into the parking lot, and the night air was cold and clean, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I could actually breathe. The story that I owed them $40,000 died in that hall and never resurfaced. They could have simply asked for help the way one person asks another for help. What they couldn't do, not after their own signatures sat on that tablecloth for everyone to see, was keep calling it a debt I'd walked away from. You cannot collect on a gift, the giver swore, in writing, was never alone. The relatives who'd been quietly preparing to chip in toward Daniel's repayment closed their checkbooks the moment they saw the dates lined up side by side. His shop folded that fall. I heard about it secondhand from Tess, the way I hear about all of them now, without much feeling left in my chest either way. I went no contact with my parents and my brother. No dramatic letter, no final blow-up. I simply stopped answering, and eventually they stopped calling, and the silence that settled in afterward was the most peaceful thing I'd felt in years. I kept the people who'd actually shown up. Walt comes for Sunday dinner now and sits in Mark's old recliner, and I've made peace with that, because someone good should be sitting there. Tess and I talk every single week. Pam's mostly retired but still answers her phone whenever I have a freight question. Dawson daughter runs 5 trucks now, every one of them deep forest green, every one carrying 3 lopsided crayon trucks painted small near the door, the kind of detail you only notice if you're really looking. People notice anyway. Drivers ask about it at truck stops, and I get to say her name out loud. Hope. My daughter. She drew that. And her name gets to ride down every interstate Mark and I ever traveled together. I finally moved the little purple boots, not far, just up onto a shelf where I can still see them every morning and still make it out the door by 4:30. And this past spring, almost a full year out, I drove back to that lake at dawn with a handful of wildflowers, the water flat and silver and still, no wind at all, and left them on the bank for the 2 people who actually built the woman I am now. The water didn't break me that time either. It just stayed calm, the way it always does, and held me steady right along with it. I don't reach for my phone out there anymore. There's no one left on the other end I'm waiting to hear from. I kept the people who showed up when there was absolutely nothing in it for them, and I let go of the ones who only appeared once there was. That, it turns out, is the entire lesson. Family was never really about shared blood. It's about who shows up when there's nothing left to gain, and who disappears the moment there is. That's my story. A funeral they didn't consider worth rearranging their schedule for. A vacation they refused to cancel. And one signed page they forgot they'd ever put their names on. If someone in your life keeps asking you to carry them while they skip your hardest days, let this be the moment you finally set the page down. You don't owe anyone a debt you never agreed to sign for. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and tell me in the comments who actually showed up for you when it mattered. I'll see you in the next one.